webinar on analytics and evidence-based leadership for your AOD workforce, which is brought to you by NGO, VAADA, and Curtin University. Before I hand over to our MC, please note all participants joining the webinar are in listen and view only mode. After the presentation, there'll be a Q&A session. Please submit your questions via the Q&A box at any time during the webinar. You can find the box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Finally, the webinar is being recorded today and will be available for viewing on the NADA website in coming days. I'll now hand you over to today's MC, NADA's Clinical Director, Susie Hudson.
Thank you so much, Sun, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Sun indicated, I'm Susie Hudson and I'm the Clinical Director here at NADA, or the Network of Alcohol and Other Drugs Agencies. We've got an exciting program for you today, but I'd like to start by acknowledging the country that we're all on today. NADA proudly and VAADA proudly acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters throughout Australia. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and to emerging leaders. And, you know, it's a really interesting segue really to a study on looking at our workforce, because we have much to learn from our Aboriginal workforce and much to learn from the clients who access treatment services. We've got a really interesting day today, and certainly we're very excited to have a number of special guests. So joining me today are NADA CEO, Robert Sterling, and VAADA, the Victorian Drug and Alcohol Network CEO, Sam Biondo. Welcome today. And in the background, but some very important people we need to acknowledge are Jane Morton from VAADA and Sian Hodge from NADA, who are really paving the way in relation to this project. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce to you Ramon Wenzel he's the Chief Investigator on this particular study, and he's a Senior Lecturer at the School of Management and Marketing at Curtin University, and the Director of the Learning for Purpose initiative, designed to research and realise the capacity, culture, and capability of for-purpose organisations. He draws on human psychology, organisational management and data analytics to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of work systems, including workforce engagement, retention and reward, professional development, health and wellbeing, and leadership. And can I tell you, that's really what today is about. It's understanding the science behind really engaging our workforce, retaining them, and seeing what we can do by looking at the data to really have a robust and engaged workforce. Today, we really hope you'll be asking us lots of questions. As Sun has indicated, we would really hope that you would pop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as we go, and we'll come to those questions at the end of the presentation. And so without much further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Robert Sterling and Sam Biondo, because they're going to really just set the scene a little bit about what is it that NADA and VAADA do in relation to workforce development. So perhaps I'll hand over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Susie. So I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're all meeting on today. For me, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal workers that are with us today. And really also just highlight the key role that the Aboriginal workforce plays in the drug and alcohol sector. I think we really need to build that workforce, and a shout out to AOD and the Aboriginal Drug and Alcohol Network, who NADA partners with here in New South Wales, that really supports Aboriginal drug and alcohol workers, because we know that Aboriginal workers do have a positive impact on the retention of Aboriginal people in drug and alcohol treatment, as well as outcomes important to Aboriginal people like strengthening connection with culture. So workforce development is a key part of an AOD peak body. And I know VAADA and NADA were both involved in a national evaluation of AOD peak bodies' role in capacity building, and certainly workforce development was one of those key roles. And it's also a priority in NADA's strategic plan, and we have that workforce development plan that's on the screen now. So NADA's really fortunate to receive funding through both the New South Wales Ministry of Health as well as the Australian Government Department of Health to support us to develop our workforce. And I'll do a shout out to the Department of Health for funding NADA's component of this study. So thank you. And so whilst it is important for government to play a role in workforce, I think it's really important for peak bodies because of that relationship that we have with our members. And for me, it's about maintaining NADA's relevance to its members. And I think to have that relevance, we really need to understand the needs of our workforce. And that's why this study is really important to NADA. And how great that NADA and VAADA can show that the rivalry between New South Wales and Victoria doesn't exist, and we can work collaboratively to meet the needs of our members. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Robert. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional lands that we're on and pay my respect to Aboriginal elders, past, present and future. And it is a great pleasure to be working with NADA on these issues. I have a lot of respect. Our organisation has a lot of respect for NADA, and it's great to have people of the calibre of Rob and Susie who make easy targets at times. And I must admit, New South Wales is always in advance, and as you can see through the current circumstances in lockdown, it's gone way ahead of where we were. But anyway, let's not dwell on that. This project is critically important. The workforce is the lifeblood of the sector, frankly. It's the lifeblood of any business, any community organisation. The workforce in our sector deals with extremely complex human interactions and issues. We need to invest in our workforce. We need to understand our workforce. We need to understand how to retain them and develop workforce. And a lot of that comes from respectful relationships, understanding what well-being means to them. And I think through the work of Ramon and Curtin University, we've actually got a really good mechanism to actually assess this situation. And I think the situation very, very similar across the nation. I know certainly I've heard issues around New South Wales and Victoria. The workforce is depleted, it's ageing, there's huge demands, the borders are closed, it's non-renewable, and we need to make sure that we have stable platform to deliver what I think is an essential service into the community. So this is what makes this piece of work so critically important. This is why we've gone into partnership with NADA, and this is why I think what Ramon is going to talk about is so critically important into the future for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, both Rob and Sam. And over to you, Ramon. Take us through this project. We're really keen to hear.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I also would like to acknowledge that I'm joining this meeting from Noongar land in WA, and recognize the Noongar people here. Thank you so much for having me and for partnering. And I will also second first that I have never been part of a partnership that sort of brings together two peak bodies across different states that work so well. So I can say there's a lot of support and commitment behind this, and which is not just great to work with, but which indeed signals the importance of that piece of work itself. So I am at the School of Management and Marketing, and I have two things today for you that I'd like to talk about. On my first sort of section here, I want to talk a little bit about what is evidence-based practice or evidence-based leadership. And this is, to me, is important in order to situate this piece of work, why we are doing this and what the intended outcomes are. And then we have a little break from me. And when I come back, I speak about what we actually do and how this is all working. So basically, if you imagine that, there's a world out there that we are addressing, and especially the member organizations of NADA and VAADA. And if I may generalize it a bit, the idea is to improve and maintain the health and well-being of people, and to maintain the health and well-being of families and of communities. And unfortunately, there are situations that people find themselves in from time to time or under certain circumstances that require different interventions or approaches. And these circumstances affect these people, and the AOD sector at large needs to address them through approaches that you are well aware of, such as counseling or detoxification, or the addressing of child abuse or domestic violence, etc. What's important here to understand is that for the most part, these interventions or approaches are rooted in an evidence-based framework. So the literature is rich and substantial for most of these topics and approaches and problem solutions, basically. Not that there's a silver bullet, or not that we know everything, but for the most part, there is a large body of literature that addresses each of these sort of singular interventions or approaches or lenses that the AOD sector needs to take. And that's something that we may take for granted or we expect. That is something that we perhaps never talk about, or we feel that just should be there. And especially if there are regulated professions such as nursing or psychotherapy, then the way people get trained and what they get trained, that comes off the back of such evidence-based literature which sits on the shoulders of giants for decades sometimes, where these scientific endeavors have been taken place. And so I want to talk about then what is evidence-based practice, just a little, and why we need this when leading people in organizations. So evidence-based practice, if you will, is nothing really new, and certainly it doesn't have to be complicated, and I don't want to indicate that it's mind-blowing. But it isn't it isn't a disruptive paradigm shift or something like that here. However, it will do something exciting and interesting and important if we put together a number of things, that namely it will help you make better decisions, or it will help your organization make better decisions. And I just want to give a few, I hope, useful examples. So this bridge here that has been built in Perth a number of years ago. I think it's almost the last bridge that has been built, or the most recent bridge that's been built in Perth. And it sits at the waterfront, and it looks a bit spectacular, and because it has these two arcs that certainly don't sit perpendicular to the water, but rather in an angle. And what we have here is that the construction or the engineering behind that is certainly something that needs consideration when we want to step foot on this bridge. We want to be sure that it holds, and if 100 people step on that bridge and jump, we want to be sure that works. And so the principle here is we want to be sure that if you step foot on that bridge, you make the assumption that it works. And it isn't just sort of by chance that it works, but a lot of testing has been done and a lot of sort of engineering background knowledge has been applied. The same goes for if you were to visit Perth and you step into a plane, if you're allowed to do that again, then you could look into a tower like this, which basically is air traffic control. And there is an air traffic control professional role, which actually doesn't sit in the tower, but which monitors the aviation airspace. And the people working there have a high sort of high degree of autonomy, but also carry a lot of responsibility, because they make sure that there's no loss of separation between different airplanes on the ground and in the air, by the way. And why do I mention that? Because work psychology probably has made the biggest contribution to this sort of role, or amongst, you know, the different professions. One of the biggest contributions was there because of that high risk environment, and because as the airline industry built up several decades ago, there was a high gain, but also high risk environment. And the worst air disasters, indeed, for the most part, came off the back of human error in these sort of aviation airspace control situations, not necessarily the pilots or engineering failure. And the contribution psychology made is in understanding how people, human beings, basically operate. So in terms of cognitive load, fatigue, how long we can concentrate. That starts with the physical environment, the humidity and the air and the lighting, but it is also about the way by which we provide information, for how long, under what sort of conditions and density and so on. And we worked out sort of, when I say we, I don't mean myself, certainly. I have just some knowledge about that, but I haven't worked on this actively. But by that, I mean the global scholarly community in this realm, understanding how people operate. And so you don't need much introduction for the next example, which is basically just, you know, you could say pharmaceuticals, but we have probably a global case here that everyone understands now, to say you wouldn't take a medical or accept a medical intervention for the most part, unless you know that there has been some testing, some trial. And yes, there might be limitation. That is a little piece of paper that you do or don't read when you take something out of the box from a pharmacy. But for the most part, we say these things work for most people, and or under certain circumstances. And you do go to the doctor, and he is or she is being asked by you to make a good decision in your case. And so we basically expect the same things for your people, right? So, and that would be evidence-based leadership. That is what we mean by evidence-based leadership. Everyone here gets the idea that using these sort of pieces of evidence in our personal or professional lives will increase the chances of obtaining desired outcomes. And so evidence-based leadership is about taking exactly these principles and apply them to how we lead and manage our people and organizations. What's interesting is that's not always the case. And to give you an idea, one study that's been done with 950 or 970 HR professionals around the world, including Australia, showed that there are large discrepancies between what managers think is effective and what the body of scientific research shows on a number of topics. And that overall trend implies that practitioners base their decisions rather on personal experience and tradition or legacy, rather than on evidence-based knowledge or expertise that's acquired through evidence-grounded applications. And what's interesting is that this sort of dilemma in managerial organizational decision-making today is often compared in sort of these reflective pieces to what the clinical practice was in the 1980s and 1990s, which is exactly where the terminology evidence-based practice or decision-making comes from. Namely, when physicians deemed their profession fairly unsystematic and too intuitive and with little notion of scientific principles in the accumulation of that sort of clinical experience. And so the upside of that is that that has changed to the better dramatically. And so that means we can do that too. And making a more informed decision isn't about using just any old bit of evidence we stumble across in some fancy way or so. It's more about understanding why is that status quo the way it is. And so a couple of reasons here. What is that problem? There's a lack of awareness and also sometimes interest for the accumulated scientific evidence. There's also knowledge, the fact that knowledge is provisional or temporary to some degree at least, namely things move on. We understand more and understand things better. And so some things change over time. And that's just a normal function of our evolution as we understand better and more. But you know, resources like your time and money, they might be restricted. And so you may not be able to invest into updating these skills or knowledge. And then there's also this sort of FOMO or fear of missing out. There are these all new and shiny things that come our way, namely in the form of social media blogs or things people tell you to do. And I mentioned the airport, and you remember probably stepping into an airport and waiting for your gate to open up, and all these bookstores that have on their shelves these books for $39.90, between 250 and 300 pages, and that promise you 3 shiny things you need to do and your life will be better. It's either your personal life, your love life, or your professional life, and how you run the world and your organization. And unfortunately, that doesn't always cut it. And some of those are just old wine in new bottles, and some of those just are completely unreliable or flawed, or in fact misleading. And so it's about getting away from that snake oil and just using what works. And some of that might be decades old, but nevertheless really useful. And some of that might be new and established, and has a lot of legitimacy now. And so what do we do instead? Well, we should using knowledge that's trustworthy and applicable in the context you are in, and much of that involves leading by evidence and obtaining the best evidence available to you under the circumstances. And there are probably 3 main sources for that. One is scientific findings, which come through systematic application of scientific approaches. Then it's organizational data and analytics, which is something I want to talk about later today. And then it's about discussing or using the experience and expertise of practitioners and stakeholders, that is you and your professional peers. And in fact, that's also something we do as part of the larger research project we committed to. We do interview managers and leaders in the AOD sector. That's not part of the large study or the large survey we are talking about today for the most part, but that's also something we do, and we integrate all these findings together. So with that, I'm done on talking about evidence-based practice, evidence-based leadership. That's really just to set the scene, why we're doing this and how is it hopefully coming together. I hand back to you.
Thanks, Ramon. So just a couple of reflections, Rob and Sam, as you're hearing Ramon speak. Sort of, how did we then sort of get to this point? I mean, we've done surveys before. What's sort of different now, and what could be brought out in this particular survey and this particular approach? Rob, did you want to start?
Sure. So yeah, thanks, Ramon. I mean, I think that was a really great way to set the scene, because I think we are really passionate about building the evidence base with our members. I think as a peak, we want to drive and lead that with our members, so that we're not needing to seek the evidence and to implement it, that we are the evidence base, because I think our workforce are the experts. We see them as the experts and we value them. So part of the purpose of this study is really to understand them so that we can foster leadership and support them in the best way that we can, but also to support them to support their own workforces in terms of managers and leaders within our members.
Can I add to Rob's comment, please, Susie?
Please do.
The circumstances of this particular research and the way in which it's actually undertaken actually hands control to the individuals that have participated and the organisations that they work for. So the individuals can get an insight into where they fit and how their thinking is, and so can the organisation. It can also benchmark into a national sort of framework with other things. So it's all relative to others. It gives great insight for an organisation which may not have had this insight of this breadth before, and that's what makes it particularly relevant. And the tools are free.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I absolutely agree, Sam. I think that is the really exciting part about this study, is the workforce analytics and giving back data to the sector, because I think often when we do research, it's a lot of them giving, but not much getting back, or getting it back in a format that's actually useful for them, rather than a journal article, which, you know, some people get off on, but not everyone likes to receive information in that way. So for me, I think that's really exciting, of how a worker can use it for themselves, about how a manager can use it with their team, and then how NADA and VAADA can use it to inform our broader sector development, and then advocate up nationally, because workforce really is a national issue.
Yeah, from my understanding, and Ramon, please correct me if I'm wrong, there's, what is there, about 30 metrics which are available for organisations to look at?
That's right. That's correct. It's a little bit more than 30, and I'll be showing that in a few minutes, or at least going over some of those. Yeah.
Right.
I think Sam picked up on something in the opening, which was about where our workforce is at the moment. I mean, both New South Wales and Victoria have copped a lot of the impact of COVID-19, and we certainly know in talking to our services that there is increased anxiety and stress within the workplace. And I don't know whether now is a good time to do a survey. I actually think it probably is a good time, because it provides an opportunity for, I think, for workers to reflect on themselves. So I'm hoping that now actually is a good time for us to do this study.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with all that you've both said in that regard, because I think too, you know, it's clear to us that we don't always get the support for our workforce that we would like, and we really do need to understand better how we can support that, but also think more about those leadership areas too. Sam, were you going to jump in there before we hand back to Ramon?
All I was going to say, it's such a headache keeping a happy workforce. I mean, it's not a problem. I mean, people are genuine in their efforts of working in the sector, but what we're facing in many states is these mega projects like the Mental Health Royal Commission or NDIS or family violence program spending that's coming in and absorbing workforce from other places. And if we know what the sentiment is, maybe we can do better in retaining the workforce, which is critically important for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think definitely that's one of the strengths of this, I think, is understanding, you know, those capabilities and experiences, so we can use that to look at how we continually to engage and retain workers in the non-government sector in particular.
Yeah, and I think that is a nice segue, really, because what we know is we've often relied upon the passion of alcohol and other drug workers that will carry them through, that their beliefs and their passion for supporting people, that's enough. And I think what we'd like to hear more now, Ramon, is how important it is to actually not just be capitalizing on that goodwill, if you like, but actually thinking really clearly and using the science to understand how we can better support and grow our workforce. So perhaps we'll hand back over to you, Ramon, to really start to talk very specifically about the study itself.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. So we coined the study the AOD Workforce Study, NGO Insights 2021, and it's something that has been communicated to you perhaps through different channels, and it's something you will hear more about. As I mentioned, this is the sort of most substantial or wide-reaching piece that we do in terms of active data generation. Flanking that or complementing that, there are other pieces of work we're doing at the moment, as in an interview study with a smaller amount of people working in that space. Now let's focus on the AOD Workforce Study. If you basically want to sum it up, then this is the chart to say this is how your organization functions. This is what work psychology and empirical management studies and science have established over years. Let me take you through this a little bit, because understanding that basically allows you to understand what we are measuring for the most part, what we are able to explain, and then what you are able to address once you understand what is an area of priority for you. So let's start with the end in mind, the outcomes on the right-hand side, because as an organization, at least for the most part, that's what you care about. I make this assumption, and if I'm wrong here, please tell me in a few minutes. But basically, as an organizational outcome, you care about the impact you have, right? The change you bring, the positive change you bring to families, individuals, and the communities. And there are also other outcomes that you care about or you have to care about. One is client satisfaction, because clients come back means there is a relationship that lasts, that helps you build or achieve that impact over time. But it also means that the transaction is maintained, and not just sort of the transaction of change behavior, but also financial transactions which allow you to run your organization and ideally generate a surplus. If that was a commercial context we talk about, right, we could talk about the value of an organization, shareholder value, and profit. But here we best discuss this as the impact you have and the client satisfaction and the surplus. These are the typical things you mainly care about as your bottom line and what you're accountable for. And then working backwards from there, what brings this about are a number of factors. And yes, there are contextual factors such as how much money might there be or funding might there be through the government, and what's the situation in the states and regulatory issues. I don't want to exclude those, but I will say that most of these organizations in the NGO space spend more than half of their funds on their people. And so that, means that there is a big lever in terms of, what you can actually control. And these people make the difference. And the difference is the service quality they deliver, or the performance at work in whatever role they are. The amount of errors that emerge by a workforce that, is highly conscientious or cares or doesn't do that so much for a number of reasons. The level of innovation, and innovation doesn't mean we invent new things or technology necessarily. It means trying new things, like I've picked up this new idea and how I can do something in the back office, or I understand now how I understand better what my clients need, and there's sort of a process to this, and I try this deliberately as a frontline worker, and once I do a bit of trial and error, and I start to innovate, and I do this because I care, and so on. These are behaviors that indeed make a difference to the ultimate outcome. It's also, and that's not new to you, about the absence rate of your staff, or the retention rate, or vice versa, how much attrition you have to deal with. And that was just mentioned a few minutes ago, that there is potentially a retention challenge to be addressed. And these are the things that you observe and that you also care about, and these are means to ends, right? Now, working further backwards about the worker states, this is how they should be. This is the amount, or this is a type of knowledge and skills that they should have. That's something that you can address to some degree. It's also about their state of health and well-being, and physically and mentally. And it's also about their motivation and engagement and commitment, and because that translates to the effort that they bring to the work. And now, again, you might say, well, I know all of this. Well, then let me tell you, here are probably the sort of 3 or 4 main domains that act as levers to address this. And they interact, they're not, I can't sort of break it down in a more accessible way than here. But that organization input, what you need to take care of as an organization, are the growth and learning experiences that people are having. And that may not be just training. The work experiences themselves, so the design of work, how much autonomy people have, and other aspects I'm going into in a small moment, and the experiences that come through that leadership, and leadership not necessarily through the formal hierarchical top-down heroic leader, but also in how we do things around here as a leadership sort of team. And this is what I mentioned, right? If you feel this is what you care most about, the relapse prevention and the counseling and the supported living as a sort of something that you provide as a service, then what I showed you just now, that's sort of what makes it all happen. And so in the study, we are looking at a broad amount, or basically there's a broad spectrum of things, and we look at some of which you've heard about. Here is again them as a list. These are probably more themes. They are not the metrics themselves, but these are broad themes. So we are looking into motivation and engagement, into professional development, into this, how people feel about their work, how they experience conflict between work and their home, not at work, but between work and family, basically. The different types of leadership experiences, whether people feel empowered or the lack of that. And also people systems, which means HR systems, for instance. So how an organization is matured or professionalized in recruiting people and retaining people, and how that all then adds up. We also collect data on largely how careers look like in that sector, to understand where do people come from, where do they sit at the moment, and what might be an aspiration of them that is rather stifled, or what could the sector offer at large for a group of people in order to provide learning experiences that are helpful directly to the quality of service that's being delivered, perhaps, but also to retain these very workers. So if you bear with me now, I want to take you through the actual elements. How does that look like? What's out there? And what basically are we asking you to do, or what are we offering you? And that's what I'm going to do. So I'll be looking at a different screen now, if you don't mind. So we have an online survey, and I'm just bringing that up here. Here we go. That should work. Yeah. So no, you can't see. Can you see the website?
Yes, that's
Yes.
fine.
Right.
Go ahead.
Fantastic. Thanks. So we build a website dedicated for this study, and which you can access by going to learningforpurpose.org/AOD. That's been given to you in a minute, again, this information. And it gives you a range of details about the why and the what and the how. And you can also pick up a PDF which answers all these questions if you want to share them with someone. And the most important part is this is where a worker or you would simply start the survey, and you would click on Start Survey, and you agree if you wanted to be doing this. And there's an option for you to, I don't want to say sign up for anything, but just to register. So you can do two things. You can pause and resume the survey if you wanted to, or you can, and as well, you'll be sent your personal analytics report, which I'll show you also in a minute. For the moment, just for in the spirit of time, I'm not doing it. But I show you basically just what that looks like. And I'm sure you have done your survey before, or some other surveys. But there are a few things I want to highlight, namely, you don't need to be given a particular token of where you work or what your organization is, but basically you would be just entering your organizational name. And so I work at Curtin University, and it's coming up as an autocomplete here. That's not helpful. I take something different. Let's say I work for Mission Australia, just making this up, not right now. I would be having all the different Mission Australias available here, and I would be able to pick myself here. Or we would have NADA available here, for instance. So this is how a worker would simply indicate where they work, and we aggregate that information in the background. And then there are all these different questions about what they work on, and how they think about their work situation, etc. So for then what happens is we aggregate that information and we use it for you as an organization, so you get direct access to it. Here is a page which is also linked from that initial page. So you would, if once you hop onto that initial landing page, you find all that information for you. But that's basically just explaining the dashboard for you. And here I opened it up as a demo, which you can access yourself. Again, there's a demo version that you can access just like that yourself. And that is the Organizational Workforce Analytics dashboard. And here is, again, on the left-hand side are these broad themes, which the survey captures and which we aggregate and which we provide back to you as a report interface. So it's about engagement and learning and development and the well-being of your workforce and the leadership experiences they are having and the people or HR systems, some of those indicators, and the work design experiences. I go through them again, but you can see that we provide a bit of an explanation what this metric is about. We have then, depending on exactly what that metric seeks to achieve, well, we break it down into a threshold, which are evidence-based thresholds between, this is probably a state of, or a fraction of your workforce that is experiencing things that are not optimal or perhaps of concerning nature. And then this is a fraction that experiences or has experiences that are in the green band, if you will. And we also provide benchmark values, which compare your organization then to the most likely cluster of other organizations. And as we have more AOD type of organizations that operate in that industry, then you be compared to them. And then you'll be able to see how you as an organization do in comparison to other organizations in your industry. And what's useful then is to go through this as a report that you have available to you at the moment. More than 5 people or 5 or more people have completed the survey that are affiliated with your organization. 5 because it starts to make sense there, and it also maintains anonymity or privacy. On that note, there is no way for you to find out who from your organization responded, and that is helpful because it allows your people to speak honestly. They may refrain from participating, but the majority gladly does participate because there is this assurance that there is this mediating mechanism, which is us, and this sort of IT mechanism, which does not provide the data to you. It does not provide the raw data to NADA or VAADA. It stays with us, it stays within a system, and here it's just reported back to you. And so you can see, for instance, that we look at psychological safety, which describes how workers feel about being able to show and employ themselves at the workspace, whether they feel I don't know is something they could say, or I made a mistake is something they could say, or that's something that they rather feel, I probably shouldn't, I'm not feeling secure enough to say anything like that because I would be put down or there's a risk to me, right? And this has massive implications, because if there is very low psychological safety, people will not speak up in a number of situations. And as a flow-on effect, basically, you have higher error rates because people, frontline workers, do not admit mistakes that can't be corrected and no one can learn from it. At the same time, you have people who can't learn from themselves because they are not receiving that feedback. So there are all these things that are happening, which is, for instance, why psychological safety is such an important metric. And we have other concepts that we measure as well. One is psychological distress, which means that is the level of the worker's anxiety and depressive symptoms. It's not exactly the same as burnout, but often it's been used in the same conversation, and it's very close to that. And it's basically a predecessor to burnout. And what it shows is if you hit a threshold, then your well-being at large is at risk, and your work performance is at risk, and your absence rate is at risk, and eventually the retention of that worker is at risk. And so these are metrics that are incredibly crucial, and so are other elements, how people perceive, how your staff perceives how the HR system operates. Whether retention is something that's being deliberately addressed in the organization or isn't, whether performance management and compensation is fair and promotion is fair, and all of these things. So you can look into them and compare how you do as an organization. I'll stop here and happy to answer any questions eventually. I just will show that that you can filter between females and males, or all respondents, and employees only and volunteers only, or all, of course. So if you have volunteers, it probably makes sense to look at volunteers only and see how they are, how they are feeling, what their experiences are. And some of this makes sense. What I also will say is we have the option, if you are a somewhat larger organization, to provide you with a dashboard for each organizational unit. So if you have, let's say, 50 employees and they are sorted into units of 10 employees each roughly, you will get a dashboard, if you want to, for one organization at large, and then for each of these 5 subunits. We need to just set this up before people start responding, and then you can start to compare this, and you can delegate this reporting also to the respective unit leaders if you wanted to. And what's also useful to note is each respondent, each individual completing the survey immediately will receive a personal analytics report, which just provides a bit of summary and analytics and annotation about a number of work experiences and states they are in. And that's been considered very helpful by a lot of people, just to see where they're at, and also to understand what it is that they could do about it. This is not to give people feedback about how bad their work experience is, not at all. I'm yet to hear an organization that comes back to us and says, here is something we did with you, or this is the survey they did, and in the end we lost half of our workforce. Everything but. It opened up these conversations. They sought out these conversations. They solicited feedback. They said, this is how I have been feeling. Now I have a terminology for some of my situations, or here's something I would like to do. For instance, craft my job a little bit to have more autonomy, for instance. So that's just to give you an insight how this all looks. And basically, if you put this together, you see that we're doing 3 things, or we're providing 3 things not just as a deliverer, but as an output for you out there. One obviously is a report for the AOD sector, which is planned for later this year. And then there are also resources which interpret and translate some of these findings for sector-wide use in the year 2022. Then there's the organizational analytics dashboard, and then there are the personal analytic reports, which are provided directly and immediately to the people completing that survey. And so that, for the most part, would sum it up. I just want to, before I finish, because Sam asked, there are about 30 metrics and sector benchmarks. The analysis, they're automatic. This thing doesn't require any setup, download, or anything on your end. It's browser-based, and we give you access to your report with a secure token. And privacy is assured. What we also want to emphasize is that this is part of the solution, right? If you remember that slide. So that allows you to then prioritize what might be the topics we table for an agenda. What is it that we need to raise and maybe investigate further? But it's not about just doing this guesswork anymore. It allows you to highlight and prioritize what might be areas of importance around here, or also to say, this does seem to be felt completely okay. I think we are doing good. We are doing well, right? And then you can reinforce these strengths. this is not just to pick on things that are working insufficiently. And so for a given individual, you would say that, you know, what are the next steps perhaps? You complete the online survey and you get your workforce analytics for free, and you enter that lucky draw as an individual. That is something you can encourage your staff to do, and they also get the chance to enter that lucky draw, including yourself, obviously. This is open to anyone and everyone in the AOD space. And yeah, I stop here in the spirit of time, and hopefully I could preempt some questions, but I believe that is where we're heading now.
Thank you so much, Ramon. That was really fantastic. And yes, please, if you have any specific questions for Ramon or Robert or Sam, please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. What I noticed as you were taking us through the actual dashboards there, Ramon, is that it actually articulates and describes each of the elements so that when you're looking at them, you can understand what it is that particular element is looking at.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So the dashboard provides some annotation about the actual metric, what it means and what its sort of outcomes are, or consequences are, if you will, so that you get an initial idea of not just what it is measuring, but why it matters. And without that, it would be largely meaningless, right?
Yeah.
And if you go back to that slide, which tells you, here, this is your impact and this is your retention and so on, right? These metrics map onto these sort of elements that I've showed earlier. And look, this is, in a sense, an important step. This is not the solution in itself, right? The solution is an ever-going loop between assessing the situation and understanding it and potentially doing something about the things that in a democratic way suggest themselves as to be addressed, as a need to be addressed, and then assessing it themselves. So we have organizations in the past where we did similar things, who then started to adopt this into their KPI framework, and they do this on an annual rotation basis, and they hold their some of their sort of line managers accountable against some of these metrics. And that's not to point their finger at them, but it's simply to say, we now have a vocabulary and we now have sort of, a reference of some sort, and it allows us to keep open the conversation, and at least once or twice a year, some do it differently. And that's something that this encourages. This is not just yet another report to file away. That would be meaningless. It's really designed to be shared, to be discussed, but also not just to give people that guesswork or say, I know what's going on, because we often don't.
Yeah, and I suppose too, what it's giving you at that individual, that organizational, and I suppose, as Rob mentioned before, thinking about more structural or advocacy level, it's providing not just what those different elements are, but presumably too, there's been some work about how to respond already to some of those elements, what things work, what the evidence tells us works, and presumably too, there's an investment from VAADA and NADA to explore with you, what the data tells us, and maybe some of the things we might need to develop to respond. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so. So the idea is absolutely to provide some annotation immediately in the report for the sector-wide report about some of those, let's say, relationships that are dominant or typical for the sector at large. And then further down the track next year to have some more actionable resources on some of the dominant topics or relationships that might be more of an area of concern or just simply necessary to be addressed for some reason, so that we give you then a more, let's say, richer vehicle to use in your own discretion. And yeah, does that answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose what it helps us to see is that whilst in some of those areas, all the research you've done to date in this area can give us some clues about how to respond, but there may be things that we specifically need to look at. There's another question that's come up. Yeah, so go on, Ramon.
Yeah, just to add to this, one important thing is the metrics that you have seen and that you can look up yourself and that we're using, for the absolute most part, they haven't come from us. I wish, but they come off the back of decades of scholarly science, basically, or scholarly efforts. And that means they're well established, very reliable and very valid sort of metrics and measurement instruments to do what we're doing. And so this is not just coming off the back of my idea or a few people. What we did is we felt there is the opportunity to do what we are doing and to bring things together that we know have high predictive validity and basically explaining what you care about. And that's what we have been doing. And so, yes, the moment you basically are able to prioritize or table an agenda, these are the 3 metrics or topics or themes that we probably need to focus on, then there is a vast majority of information and literature and other resources that we can tap into or make available or curate. And that's sort of something we need to work out in this project further down the track, how that might look like for a sector. But that's a beauty of it. So that's not just sort of my brainchild and me making up stuff, just to be clear. That's really coming off the back of what hundreds of people far greater have established over decades. So
Fantastic.
Just to put this out there.
Thank you. Thanks, Ramon. We've got a question here about the end date for how long the tool and the outputs will be available to people.
Sure. Good question. So the study itself, the online study, is open until the 30th of August, and there might be a slight chance that we extend that open window for a little bit, but get into it now so your people and you do complete the survey. The tool itself then will be there forever. So we have been doing similar work since 2017 with the not-for-profit sector, and everyone still has access to their tool from each year whenever they have been doing it. There's nothing, that would change our plan. And the availability then of that tool, I can't give a date to it because it just sits there as many other things on the web these days.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ramon. I'll throw now to Rob. Were there any particular questions you had now that you've really seen that come to life, Rob, about the analytics or the benchmarking, perhaps?
No, not at all. I mean, I think my main questions are how do we get people to complete it? And I think that's the challenge that we often have, is to get people to value inputting into this study and seeing the benefit. I mean, I think Ramon has just shown the benefit, certainly to managers of services, and hopefully by seeing that, services will promote it to all levels of their staff to do it, including themselves.
Great. And Sam, any just final words? We're coming to the end of our session today, but some final last words before we give a good old plug for people to do the survey?
Well, I think it's always a survey season in the AOD sector, but this one's an important one because the insights for the individuals, the agencies, and for the sector itself are really important. I do see quite a number of sector notables in the attendance list. So, I'm calling on you. I will come knocking.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sam. And Ramon, do you want to, I suppose really what we'd really be encouraging everybody to do is to get online, to complete the survey, to encourage their staff to do that. Any last words from you, Ramon?
Look, I believe what's probably useful to share here, but it is in the FAQ, it says on the information page, obviously. But completing the survey roughly takes about 25 minutes for an individual. That's, let's be realistic and don't sort of scam people or anything. But these 25 minutes may be split up. If you sort of provide or register, you are able to pause and resume. And 25 minutes is what a lot of people sort of do over lunch, and sometimes watch the Olympics or do something else. Whilst all that's important, I believe actually providing that opportunity during work time is the right thing to do and is the most reliable mechanism for people to complete it. And I think that's something that's often within the hands of the people like you participating in this webinar today and communicating it that way rather than asking people to do it on their way home or doing it in their free time. I think that's something to consider. And other than that, feel free to reach out directly to me. The contact details are provided and are also on the website, etc. What's more is we would like to reach out to you subsequent to this webinar later today or tomorrow, just with a brief summary of this information being shared today and also the next steps, so you can just peruse that in your own time again, and encourage you to at least look into it. I think for the AOD sector, and in fact many other NGO not-for-profit sectors, this has not been done before. And so I applaud the AOD sector, NADA and VAADA, to be doing this with us in this sort of concerted effort. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us, Ramon and Rob and Sam and Jane, and thanks to Sian as well. Thank you for all joining us today on this important webinar. We want you to log on and do that survey for us. You'll also find a little evaluation dropping into your inbox at the close of today's presentation. Please join us again for future webinars. Take care out there and use your time wisely and fill in the survey. So thanks a lot, everybody. Take good care. Bye.